Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched The Quick and the Dead from 1995. Now, I can't for the life of me actually remember why this ended up on my recent list of things to watch. The way this usually works is I get reminded of one thing or another. I open a new tab, I pull up the Wikipedia page about a movie or something like that, and I put it off to the side for review later of like, oh yeah, that was a thing I was going to watch at some point, if I haven't already, queued something up in my existing queue, so to speak. So I can't actually remember why this one came across to me, and it wasn't already in my collection at the time, so I had to go and find it. This is a movie I knew almost nothing about going into it, other than it was a Western with a lot of notable actors in it, and also directed by Sam Raimi. Although I actually don't recall whether I knew that going into it or if I just saw it when during the starting credits. But there it is, and you'd be hard pressed to tell give a more clear and concise explanation of what this movie is than Sam Raimi makes a Western. I know Sam Raimi is a sometimes polarizing artistic figure. I don't think many people think he's a bad director, but he has a certain style and certain priorities in the way that he films and directs things that is definitely not to everybody's taste. Personally, I'm a fan, and I don't know how much of his total catalog I've watched, but I have watched a decent number of films by him, and I like him quite a lot. I appreciate a lot of what Sam Raimi has kind of uniquely to offer, and that's not to say nobody else can, but Sam Raimi is willing to make some weird decisions to make a unique film that don't always hit, but they're at least interesting, and you'd be hard pressed to ask for more than that sometimes when it comes to Hollywood. Now, I didn't again know much of anything about this other than seeing a few of the names on it, and apparently Sharon Stone is one of the co-producers as well as being the lead actor on the film. And that is very curious to me because Sharon Stone was a really big name throughout sort of the 80s and 90s, and definitely had a lot of cachet in the industry and a lot of literal cash to influence and pay for things and ensure they got to be the way she wanted them to be. And apparently that is has a substantial amount to do with why this movie got produced at all, which I find very curious. To me, not knowing that much about Sharon Stone other than what I've seen her in, this, if I had to guess without any other context, I would have assumed this was Sharon Stone attempting to branch into a new genre, and not necessarily, and she seems to, well, in most of her movies she takes herself fairly seriously, plays fairly serious characters. So to find out that she in fact was an advocate for Sam Raimi, who typically makes horror and comedy stuff, as well as a lot of the other things that make this a bit less of a serious film, was curious to me, to say the least. The rest of the cast is pretty star-studded, although a lot of the people who we would consider stars now at the time were basically nobodies. Leonardo DiCaprio had basically no roles at this point. I mean, Titanic wouldn't be for another how many years? 2? 4? I don't actually remember when Titanic came out. It's like 97 or 99 or something. So he's like even younger than that here. He's very much a baby-faced kid. And then having Russell Crowe as one of the major lead roles as well is interesting because at the time he was basically unknown in Hollywood. I think he had a few small roles, but certainly not a lead, and apparently was his placement here was fought back against by other production, or well, the corporate producers, let's say. So that's all rather interesting. Meanwhile, you have Gene Hackman and a number of other folks who are more, well, Gene Hackman's probably the biggest name overall in it after Sharon Stone. And then there's a lot of other sort of random side characters who are notable character actors, but you wouldn't necessarily know by name. But this was not, this was not a nobody cast list by any means. And for a fairly small budget, this was did, I think, pretty interesting work, to say the least. This is far from a traditional Western by many standards, and the choice of having Sam Raimi as the director, who even at this point was a fairly novice director. Well, not a novice director, but a relatively small and indie director, and not one super well known in Hollywood. This was an interesting choice because his body of work was still telling of his stylistic choices and those sorts of things. Meanwhile, as I understand it, the writer is he's somebody whose name I recognize, but I can't put a finger on exactly what I know him from. Simon Moore is a British writer who I think primarily has done sort of semi-comedic stuff and that sort of thing. So seems like a good choice for having Raimi as a director, but is curious in a variety of ways for a Western. And on top of that, like we've talked about previously, Westerns have gone through their ups and downs, and in the middle of the 90s, this was certainly not the heyday of the Western. As we talked about during that other movie, man, what was even the name of it? I can't even remember the name of it. I don't even remember if it was a 90s movie. I was going to quote it as a 90s movie. It was either a late 80s or 90s Western that we watched some time ago now that it was so kind of fairly dull and unremarkable in a lot of facets that this was a time of reinventing the Western if it existed at all. And whereas that movie really tried to turn it into sort of the traditional action movie of the 80s and 90s, this takes sort of an entirely different look at it in a whole bunch of ways. Primarily, it throws out a lot of the structure one might expect from a Western, first and foremost. I'm going to talk a little bit about the plot, but I don't think anything I'm about to say spoils anything, really. The start of the film starts with a woman on a horse riding into town. Well, there's a little bit before that, but woman on a horse rides into town. She looks like a gunslinger, so on and so forth. And there's a lot of inferences you can take from just the way things are framed, the way she's dressed, and the inferences you have about the setting and the time period, that being a woman, she's a bit out of place, and but the grimace on her face and her sense of her capability as prior set up in the prior scene establishes that she's not completely out of her depth, at least. And so that sets up the idea that she's probably there on a revenge story, as is traditionally the case with a lot of Westerns. But how that actually unfolds subsequently, if you were expecting that kind of story and really wanting that, you're going to end up disappointed, because really what unfolds is a whole series of silly vignettes, or semi-serious, semi-silly vignettes, between a large cast of various characters, all with different levels of comedicness, absurdity, tropiness, and all these other things. That said, it does sort of take a good balance of comedy and seriousness, and not just because it's trying to tell sort of multiple stories at the same time. On the one hand, it's absolutely, playing off the tropes of Westerns and other genres as well, to set up a lot of sort of tropified characters and other sort of over the top situations that set up for, you know, short-term payouts, I would say. Scenes that play out from end to end, and that's sort of the full extent of that scene's story, and have limited influence on the total movie overall. But that's not to say that they aren't without value as a result. A lot of what the movie is really telling you more about the setting itself, the town that the whole movie is basically set in, the type of people who are there, the type of people who show up there, and the type of people who are there at that time for this particular set of events that's unfolding, and what their motivations or lack thereof are. And it plays enough into the traditional tropes to let you both to like do a lot of storytelling without a lot of footwork. It doesn't need to exposit a lot to tell you who characters are, how they're going to behave, or even what's about to probably happen to them, because you already understand, like, these are very well laid out things. So the story itself really is not a surprise at any point. That said, it does sort of waver between these two different stories, because that revenge story is present in the movie, but to me it doesn't strike me as being front and center in the least. And this is where I get kind of confused with, in addition, with Sharon Stone being one of the co-producers. This movie feels like it has sort of two movies going on in parallel, where you have a silly story about a silly town where there's a lot of outlaws doing silly things, and they're having dumb gunfights for slapstick and or, you know, slight horror movie trope type things, body horror and those sorts of things. But at the same time, there's a fairly, well, not even fairly, there's a very serious but not very deep narrative story going on with Sharon Stone's character, and who I think is just they just call her the lady through the whole thing, but then at some point she gets a name, which is Ellen, which is, it's just very weird. I remember her name because it's weird that she gets a name, because she kind of doesn't need one in the context. It makes more sense, and it makes her more mysterious if she doesn't have it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's very weird because her whole narrative exists in sort of a parallel plane where it intersects multiple times with all these other players who are having their own story going on. And there's like two other characters who are directly related to this very serious story. But they don't get, in addition to not having a lot of runtime and having a script that is not particularly focused on them, the wavering in acting tone from scene to scene sometimes, where we seem to be taking fairly seriously her story about revenge and her motivations and all these things, the depth of her character and the seriousness of her choices does not suit that. So it kind of falls a bit flat. There's a couple scenes in particular that I think don't work particularly well, exactly because they can't really betray the other side of the story too much. There is actually another interesting thing I found in a quick skim when I was looking this up after. One of the scenes I dislike the most in the film is there's an intimate scene between Sharon Stone's character and Russell Crowe's character, and apparently Sharon Stone herself cut that out of the film for the theatrical release, but then it was re-added to all of the releases after that. And she's correct. It should be removed from the film. It makes no sense. It's a weird romantic subplot that only exists basically for that one scene and doesn't need to, and cheapens the whole thing and distracts from it. It's probably because of the nudity that they kept it in for intrigue. Anyway, it doesn't need to be there. It makes no sense. But there's a couple of other scenes as well with her character being a little bit more serious and a little bit more motivated about her intentions on getting her revenge. But because this other narrative is going on about all these characters having their little vignettes, she can't be successful. And you already know that's going to be the case. You know she's not going to go through with her plan or something like that because she can't, because the rest of the movie would collapse if she did. So it's just a little confusing what exactly happened in the writing process. By all accounts, the writer, well, there were some rewrites, but the original writer says that it's more or less his original script, allegedly. So I'm a little confused how exactly they would have gone about this differently at any point, or whether this was always the intended product. But that said, with it being Sam Raimi, and a writer who's, I think, a bit known for comedy, like I said, it does raise the question for me of like, how do you balance a movie trying to be fairly cheesy and trying to upend a lot of the tropes of the Western while still telling a compelling narrative? As I've talked about with many other films before, like, how do you fix a movie per se with the least amount of changes, with the least amount of content change or tone change or rewriting or whatever? How do you, I'm always trying to look to not write a whole new movie, if at all possible. Just how do you fix what's sort of wrong with it? And nothing is glaringly wrong with it, but with this film, but it is, as a result of the aforementioned problems, kind of not that compelling. So I think it needs to go kind of more over the top and cheesier. And it's almost the kind of thing I wish Raimi had made later in his career, because while there are a lot of Raimi hallmarks in here, there's certainly a level of what appears to be lack of confidence to go for more absurdity, to ask for actors to ham it up even more than they already are. And so there are moments of true, like, Raimi brilliance, really wacky, crazy, cheesy stuff that I love, and that would almost work all the better if everybody except Sharon Stone's character was being wacky and she was just playing everything straight. If she's essentially the straight man to all the comedy. But I still think it would be a little bit odd. You'd need to marry the two narratives a little bit closer, and I think ultimately the problem is that Sharon Stone's character never engages in the comedic aspects. She's always dead serious, and every other character, well, same with Russell Crowe's character also. Well, he sort of has a little moment here and there, but she has no moments of interacting with the comedy, of not taking it seriously. And it's a shame because, like I said, with her being co-producer and one of the people who pushed for these things, it seems like the kind of thing where she would be able to notice that, like, she could be misperceived under the circumstances as taking the movie too seriously when everybody else was not. But that's down to directorship and that sort of thing anyway. So anyway, to loop back around to talking about the technical aspects of the film rather than the contents, a lot of this comes down to the good and the bad. Ultimately comes down to a lot of the technical things. So like I was saying, I think the acting generally is very good. I don't it's acceptable to good. I don't think any of it is particularly great. I have definitely seen better performances from a lot of these actors. And I think that in part is, again, probably partially just Raimi being a little bit new to directing big names and things like that. And I think he's even said as much about this film. At the same time, the writing really does not help. The writing is not bad, but it's unremarkable and a little bit thin in many ways. And that's okay for comedy because the comedy relies a lot more on the timing and visuals and those sorts of things. but for those dramatic narrative elements, again, the character development is just not there, and the quality of the writing, the character writing, is not enough to push to make up for the fact that the runtime for those dramatic narrative elements is a little bit too short to really be engaging. As far as all the other production things, I think this is a really well produced film. Editing, generally really great. I love the look of this film, generally speaking. It is not washed out and dirty. It's not the most colorful film by any means, but it's certainly not doing the gray and brown thing. It's very willing to have a good chunk of color, and use a lot of light. Well, let's get to the cinematography and stuff. It's very well shot, it's very well framed, and it's very well lit. And I love Raimi's directing style. Raimi is one of the few people out there who really treats the camera as it's such a crazy dynamic element of the of composition. He loves to just throw the camera around, do all kinds of crazy moves. There's a whole bunch of snap zooms and weird other swivels and all kinds of things all over this film, and that's a ton of fun and adds visual intrigue while also like adding to the sort of natural wackiness of that. But that's not to say that he isn't totally capable of also shooting just really well framed long shots and stills and panning and all these other things. All of those are done totally competently as well. And all of that is shooting people who are very well costumed and made up, and a set that is it's a very theatrical set. It's not the most believable like Old West town, but it's not supposed to be. That's sort of the tone, is it's cheesy and over the top and very theatrical. So but it's still a great set, even if it's not a believable set. And then everything is shot with wonderful lighting, which Raimi always uses. I think it's something that he's not always, because of the wackiness of some of his actual camera work, is not always recognized for the way that he styles what is in the shot. So there's lots of great lighting choices and things like that. Lots of like half shadow type shots and things like that are just visually fantastic and make for a lot more intrigue on screen. There's not a lot of flat lighting. There's not a lot of there's no boring shots, and that's really what it comes down to. To wrap all of that up, you've got a solid soundtrack that sort of sets a very traditional Western tone, while also knowing when to be a little bit silly, when to be a little bit serious, and fit the tone at any given time. And overall, despite my issues with these twin narratives, I think it's actually a very well-paced film. None of the scenes linger too long. None of them are like truly a waste of time or anything like that. They always have intention to them very much, and they do exactly what they intend to and not much more, and that's kind of great. So ultimately you get a movie that is not a particularly good Western if you just want a Western, and it's not a particularly good action movie if you want that, but it's a very entertaining film. Its entertainment level vastly exceeds what the sum of its parts are. And so if you're just sort of looking for a semi-brain dead, entertaining good time, I certainly think you could do worse than this. There's a lot going on. It's just kind of fun. Everybody seems to be having fun on the set, and it's unique if nothing else. Certainly if you're a Raimi fan and you haven't seen this one, I would recommend it for that as well. But there's just a lot to appreciate here, even if the ultimate outcome is sort of a not great, not super compelling film a lot of the time. But I enjoyed it, and I don't know if I'd recommend it to a lot of people or not, but under the right circumstances for the right people, I would definitely recommend it. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'll see you guys next time.